Good afternoon from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. My name is Ashley Fortune, and I would like to welcome you to our webinar series that's held in partnership with the USGS National Climate Change Wildlife Science Center. They're located in Reston, Virginia. This series highlights their sponsored science projects related to climate change impacts and adaptations, and aims to increase awareness and inform participants like you about potential and predicted climate change impacts on fish and wildlife. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Sean Carter, Senior Scientist, to introduce our speakers. Sean?
Thanks, Ashley. Today it's my pleasure to introduce Allison Meadow and Dan Ferguson. Here's some background for Allison. Allison is currently the Staff Scientist to the Center for Climate Adaptation Science and Solutions at the University of Arizona. And the mission of CCAS is to strengthen and support adaptation, risk management, and resilience efforts at multiple scales by providing intellectual leadership, training, and engagement with a focus on solutions. Prior to that, she was the program manager for our Southwest Climate Science Center. That's where I know Allison from. She did a wonderful job. She has a background in environmental anthropology, and our research focuses on the process of linking scientists and stakeholders to co-produce climate science knowledge. She's also works on several multidisciplinary teams that are focused on helping emergency and resource managers, particularly those in tribal communities, plan and adapt to climate change. Dan Ferguson directs the climate assessment of the Southwest, or CLIMAS, for what I know as Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessment Programs, the RISAs. CLIMAS brings together multiple academic disciplines with a variety of experts from outside the academy to help regional decision makers prepare for and respond to climate events and climate changes. His research focuses on three areas: climate impacts and adaptation strategies in Native American communities in the Southwest, methods and processes for building scientist-practitioner partnerships to address climate-related issues in society, and the communication of science. In addition to this, Dan's actively involved in connecting environmental science and decision-making, the degree program, certificate at the University of Arizona, and he helps to teach course seminars for that program. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Allison Meadow and Dan Ferguson.
Thanks a lot, Sean.
Thanks, Sean.
And thanks for inviting us to do this webinar. We are going to talk today about a paper that came out earlier this year in the spring called Moving Toward the Deliberate Co-Production of Climate Science Knowledge. That was an opportunity for us to really synthesize a lot of the work that we had been doing both through the CSCs and through CLIMAS and in many other projects over the years, pull it all together and really try to draw out some lessons for moving forward with this kind of collaborative and integrated climate science work. So here we go. Let's see. Oh, I got to push the little button to get the slides. There we go. The question of the role of science in society and science in decision-making is not at all new. Stokes actually traced the split all the way back to the Greek philosophers who were separating basic and applied science into sort of inquiry and use. So this is something that we as a society have been wrestling with for a long time and most likely will continue to wrestle with. In 1945, Vannevar Bush sort of solidified this in the modern framework when he articulated the difference between basic and applied research and constructed a framework by which knowledge is developed in the domain of science and then handed to the domain of society so that science could be in this pure realm, insulated from the value world of applications, and then once that was done, it could be handed off. What we've discovered later in the century and really continue to discover is this what's been called the loading dock approach is not particularly helpful when we are dealing with wicked problems. These are these complex, really value-laden problems, particularly those that come out in climate change, environmental management, and decision-making, where it's truly possible to have multiple competing goods and many different views of the issue, and I really like this little image of, everybody thinking that they know exactly what the other person is talking about. I think that's a great way to summarize wicked problems. So in the late 1990s, we got a surge of interest in figuring out what was going on here. This term descriptive co-production comes from a woman named Ava Lovebrand, and I have all of the references for this at the very end, so if anybody is interested in following up, don't worry, you'll have that opportunity. So she used this phrase descriptive co-production to kind of capture some work that was going on in the late 90s, largely by Sheila Jasanoff and others, in which they were studying the scientific and policy process, especially around things like the Montreal Protocol that was going on at the time. And what they found was that this interplay between science and society was just simply a more accurate representation of the way in which the knowledge was being produced. That this split that we've been envisioning between science and society, between these, these two worlds, is just not accurate. And to the extent that we admit that and allow for that interplay to happen, what they were seeing is that that the science was easier to use, that it was applied more readily, and I keep forgetting that it's not that little button. So then we get to this second quote of theirs, which I really like, because then they started sort of to look forward and speculate that generally accepted scientific explanations about the world, particularly about things as complicated as climate change, would emerge through the construction of communities of belief that provide legitimacy through inclusion rather than exclusion, through participation, and through transparency. And really their point was that when the scientists and decision makers work together to develop that knowledge, that the knowledge, the information is demystified. It is no longer this sort of scary external knowledge that is outside of the decision maker's realm or outside of their agency. It becomes something that they have ownership of, that it is internal knowledge. And when it's internal knowledge, when they understand how it has been constructed, they're much more likely to use it. They understand it, they trust it, and they're much more likely to use it. So that act of collaboration makes the science more usable. So then we get to a phase where that idea was kind of reframed into something that we should be doing, a model for developing science and policy going forward. And again, Lovebrand used the terminology prescriptive co-production, the idea that you should do this now. We should all be working together. One of the foundational papers here was in Lemos and Morehouse, in which they talked about the key component in this co-production process is iterativity, which rests on three requirements: stakeholder interaction, keeping the focus on the production of usable science, and interdisciplinarity, sort of recognizing that most of these problems can't be solved by a single scientific discipline or really even a decision-making discipline, that we have to integrate all, various types of knowledge and various realms of knowledge. All of that, your ability to do those three things, to have that interaction, keep the focus on usable science and interdisciplinary, rests on three variables. Fit, how well the information is fitting with the decision maker's needs. Flexibility, your ability as a researcher to work in this multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary world, bringing in different people, your willingness to sort of cross some of those imagined boundaries, and whether you have the resources to do it, the time, the money, the energy, all of those things. So those all play in to your ability to have this iterative process. So again, that's that prescriptive co-production that came out in sort of the mid-2000s. I think we can kind of summarize the general principles there, that, that the iterativity model, basically they, in later work boiled it down to kind of three things. You've got to establish long-term relationships between scientists and stakeholders and decision makers. You have to have a trust in that relationship. And it's got to be two-way communication. We have just got to dispense with the idea that the scientists can hand off something and that they are the keepers of the knowledge and then the decision makers will use it. It has to flow back and forth. So those are the big, broad principles. Then we get to, oh, wow, how do we do that? We're all busy. We all have all of this other work that we're supposed to be doing. How do we actually get those relationships? How do we maintain that two-way communication? How do we build the trust? Well, I've got good news. The social sciences have been doing collaborative research for more than 50 years. So we've got great guideposts for doing this. Collaborative research in the social sciences was always about empowering communities, empowering stakeholder communities, building those relationships, having researchers come in, bringing a certain amount of expertise, but really facilitating processes where communities learn their own knowledge, they learn how to apply it, they learn how to evaluate its use. Action research, which is a couple of the little examples on the screen here, is really the foundational method or approach in the social sciences to doing collaborative research. So a lot of what comes next in this talk builds from this point of saying, hey, we've got guideposts out there. There are models that we can use. So this is a really important point. How we do this collaboration really matters to the outcomes. This was captured, I think, brilliantly by the National Research Council report in 1996. Get the participation, get the right participation, so pick your approach properly, and get the participation right. It's worth our time and energy to do this well because it does influence the outcome of the research. When we're dealing with decision makers, what they need, how they perceive information, how they perceive their decision-making process also matters. I think a lot of this co-production stuff is much closer to the social science method of ethnography than sort of public participation. I think public participation still it's still a little too superficial, this idea that maybe we could have workshops and meetings and we're pulling information from stakeholders. No, I think we need to spend the time and energy to get to know what those decision makers need and have them learn more about our process as researchers, our constraints, our strengths, so that it really is, that we really are developing a relationship and it's a trusting relationship. Which brings us to what we decided to call deliberate co-production. And this is what we're, as the title says, what we think we're moving toward. I don't think we're quite there yet, but I think that we are moving in that direction. We're defining that as a strong collaborative process designed around specific collaborative goals. It's explicitly planned into the research project and the process, and it's executed effectively. Again, we're choosing the right participation and we're doing it well. And we think that that is going to result in more usable and used climate science. And now we'll move into some of the ways in which we think we can achieve this goal. In the paper that sort of forms the basis of this, we drew really heavily from some work that came out of the international development field. Biggs, in 1989, constructed this really nice little model of modes of engagement. And again, he was working in a development context, so it's not an absolutely perfect fit. Also, his terms are a little bit confusing given, what we talk about. We use the term collaborative research, to sort of apply to all of this kind of stuff, and he's got that as one particular mode. So don't get too hung up on the names of the modes, but looking a little bit more at the different objectives and the ways in which stakeholders are involved in different ways. Contractual mode is very much, I think, that old kind of loading dock, still with an applied underpinning, that the science is intended to be used in the real world, but it really is sort of the scientist goes, tests this idea of technology or this new knowledge, and then hands it off to stakeholders. And it's the stakeholders are very passive recipients. Consultative mode, we're really spending more time with the stakeholders, maybe bringing them in the problem definition, the research design, diffusion of findings. And this research it's focused on real-world problems, and we are seeing much more integration and work with the stakeholders. What Biggs calls the collaborative mode is a very continuous process of stakeholder engagement. And a joint diagnosis of the problem. So not just that the scientist diagnoses the problem, but that there's a real collaborative effort at the beginning to say, okay, what's really going on here? What Biggs calls the collegial mode, this really gets into that old, the sort of foundational idea in the social sciences of action research. So it's not just collaboration between scientists and stakeholders, but that the scientists are actively supporting and facilitating the ways in which community members or stakeholders engage in their own research, develop their own knowledge. So it's a really intensive and relationship-oriented process. We don't think that the contractual mode, as Biggs defined it, is sort of meets those standards of co-production of knowledge. It is, however, an effective model in some cases. There are certainly situations where a stakeholder just needs data, knows how to use it, and just needs that data. And so if that is meeting a stakeholder need, that is a totally appropriate mode to engage in certain circumstances. So I just don't want to toss that out there as like not useful. It is, just not necessarily co-producing knowledge. What we then looked at was a really small sample of different approaches to collaborative research that we sort of could fit into each one of those modes. Action research I've already mentioned a few times. It really just meets that collegial mode. It's a stakeholder-defined problem. The research team is really just acting as facilitators. They're supporting what's going on among the stakeholders, but letting the community or the stakeholders really define the problem and move forward with the research. Transdisciplinarity is also a collegial mode of engagement where we really see an equal partnership between scientists and stakeholders. There tend to be more technical questions involved in a transdisciplinary project, so that the scientists really are bringing really crucial knowledge in. It's just that it's melded in a really effective way with local knowledge or with stakeholder needs. Rapid assessment process is asking the scientists to really act a little bit like ethnographers. Go in and find out what your stakeholders' context for decision making is. What do they need? How do they define these terms? And then working together to develop solutions. Participatory integrated assessment is something that has been used by multidisciplinary teams over the years. It really focuses on a couple of things, scenario planning and developing integrated models, but again, it's a process by which you can take the scientific knowledge, take local knowledge and priorities, and meld that in a very nicely structured model. And boundary organizations can work across pretty much all of the modes of engagement and any kind of research question. And these are, existing organizations or one that get developed to solve a particular problem who have some expertise in doing collaborative research and multidisciplinary research. And we are going to just highlight a couple of projects that Dan and I have been involved in the last few years, just to give you sort of a tangible example of some of these approaches. This is a project that occurred through CLIMAS, co-designing climate information with FEMA, and we're sort of in the process of wrapping up, but still trying to find ways to keep it going. We were approached by the response division of FEMA. These are the guys who monitor all of the activities in the western region to see what's coming, what emergencies might they need to respond to, and they want to integrate climate into their decision making in a more effective way. So we recognize, first of all, they have a very sophisticated information use and decision-making framework, and our job was really going to be how do we integrate and feed some climate information into that existing framework. It is one small piece of the kinds of information they're looking at. We could not disrupt their decision framework and use framework at all. We needed to figure out how that worked and how best to, for lack of a better word, sort of just inject that climate information in there. So again, we've used this rapid appraisal process, a little more like ethnography. Let's really learn how this organization works. So we did interviews. You can see a couple of the quotes, focus groups. We spent a lot of time reviewing internal documents like their daily operations briefing to understand how information flows through the agency. And we sat in their offices and did some participant observation for quite a while to figure out, okay, what are the kinds of conversations you're having? How are you interacting with this information on a regular basis? And then we worked with them to design an online dashboard to feed some climate information, again, into a system that they already had. And we're continuing to refine it.
Hey.
Dan finally gets to talk.
So I'm just going to mention really quickly, I have a project that's been ongoing that Allison was part of as well. That's been going for the last several years, and we took a transdisciplinary approach. So just before I get to that project, briefly I just want to review the specific framework we were using when we talk about transdisciplinarity. And really what it comes down to is we're trying to address, it's sort of interdisciplinary plus. So you're trying to address a societal problem specifically. That's the important thing, and this goes to a lot of what Allison was just talking about in general with these approaches. So it's very collaborative, but it's not just collaborative among disciplinary experts, say at a university. It's also between researchers, and in the language of the paper that's cited here, extra scientific actors, which we like to think of as regular people. So it's collaborative among us, the research community, but also among people who are going to consume this information. And then the idea here is that there's two big ideas. One is that you're trying to foster mutual learning so that the researchers are understanding better the context, as Allison's been talking about, and also your partners have a better insight into how we work and what information they may use, that kind of thing. And the other big idea is that the whole point of transdisciplinarity is to try to integrate knowledge, and that's actually the crux of the entire process. It's incredibly difficult to integrate these kinds of knowledge because they're very different, and this could be social and natural sciences. That kind of integration is difficult, and then you throw in the plus, which is extra scientific actors or regular people, and the knowledge they bring to the table, and that integration is incredibly challenging. So this project, very briefly, so this has been funded for the last 4, 5, 6 years, maybe 5 years. It's been funded through NOAA. The primary contributor has been the National Integrated Drought Information System, NIDIS. And the big question was, again, they came to us. The Hopi Tribe Department of Natural Resources really wanted to figure out, we've had a persistent drought out here for at least 15 years, depending on where you are. And the Natural Resource Department was very concerned about monitoring for drought and whether they were able to have enough information to make decisions. So we've been working with them in this transdisciplinary mode for the last few years to try to understand, kind of like Allison said, my training is also very much in ethnography, trying to understand how the DNR works, how they can consume information, how they use information, what kind of information is valued, and so forth. And the upshot is we've been trying to develop a monitoring system and a protocol for them that allows them to do what they needed done, which was essentially make decisions about changes on the landscape that might need to happen, for example, removing stock as a result of drought. So that project, we like to think of it as transdisciplinary. It has an knowledge integration element in the sense that we're trying to bring the problem with this project, or the problem with the context, was that there is not very much data, weather or climate data, available on the reservation. So that was the crux, was there's not much to work with in terms of traditional data. So we're bringing what data is available, and we're doing analysis on that data that's regional, and then we've been working with the tribe to have them do observations that are more local to figure out things that they're interested in that are responding to drought. And we're trying to blend those two kinds of knowledge together to provide a monitoring system for the tribal government, essentially. And then another example from the approaches we put in the paper is the idea of boundary organizations, which I'm certain all of you have an idea in your mind what this term means, boundary organizations, and perhaps you're attached to something that is called one, like the CSEs. The trick is CLEMAS has been around for a really long time, and it's been written about as a boundary organization. So we got funded in 1998 initially. So we've actually been studied quite a bit. Over the years, I bristle at it a little bit because it gets thrown around in a way that it gets a little mushy. So what we did in the paper was we pinned down the 4 ways that I think David Cash described boundary organizations, the roles they play, and that was convening, translating, collaborating, and mediating. And I'm just going to give you a really quick example here of a very recent, just last month, our role as a convener, and that was my colleague Greg Garfin put together a workshop about high-impact, low-probability events, specifically focused on heat, water, and energy and the nexus of those. And the point really is that we were in a unique position to convene this kind of workshop. So he brought together, it was a small group, maybe 30 people. These were evenly divided roughly between researchers and practitioners who were concerned about the cascading effects, essentially, these very complex problems, like Allison mentioned, these wicked problems that would come from let's say, a very high heat event that took down the power grid or something. And obviously that would cascade through society. So Greg convened, CLEMAS convened that meeting and basically tried to get everybody's perspectives at the table, like how would we deal with this kind of thing, what can we do going forward, and that's the output of that meeting is going to be trying to articulate some paths forward for collaborations. And I should say that the Bureau of Reclamation actually funded this project. So that's another role of this convening organization is you have connections, you have a huge network you're working within, and you're able to pull together the right people at the right time. And one last thing I'll say about boundary organizations as CLEMAS as a boundary organization, is Allison's FEMA project is also another example of CLEMAS as a boundary organization. We've been around, like I said, since 1998, so various groups, stakeholders, partners come to us for projects. And because we exist in that way, the collaboration that developed another role of boundary organizations is collaboration. The collaboration that developed between Allison and her colleagues, her CLEMAS colleagues, and FEMA is basically another example of a boundary organization at work.
So that's some of our past and existing work, and I just wanted to touch briefly on how we're applying these concepts of modes of engagement, co-production, and approaches going forward. I feel very fortunate. I have a project that is funded through the Southwest Climate Science Center to develop a framework to do project-level evaluation of these collaborative climate science research projects. So we're looking at a set of case studies that have all been funded by the Southwest CSC, and we're really looking carefully at how they're doing collaboration, what those processes, what those activities are, and then what the outputs, the outcomes, and the impacts of those projects are. And we're trying to feed that, our findings, both to the project PIs to say, hey, this worked really well, here's something to consider for next time so that there's some reflection and learning there, but also feed that back up to the program level to help inform program development going forward. And similarly,
so CLEMAS has also been doing, well, for quite a while, we've been doing versions of evaluation, initially at the project scale, and in the last 3 years, I suppose, we've been doing program-level evaluation. And the only thing I'd really add to what Allison just said is we're looking at each of the, CLEMAS is made up of people, and the people do projects of all different kinds. And we've been looking at specific projects and trying to understand each project, but also trying to scale that up to what does that mean. What is the impact that CLEMAS as a program has in our region, because we are regionally focused in Arizona and New Mexico, and we're trying to have, our mission essentially is to, help our region respond to climate variability and change. So we're trying to understand the program level. How do these projects aggregate to a program, and how does that program have an impact? How do we succeed in our mission? Very similar to what Allison's doing with the CSC, but just at a program scale instead of just with projects. So we're at the point, where we actually, because we've been working through these case studies and because CLEMAS has been doing similar work for a while, we're starting to see some lessons and things that we can start to build on. The first thing that certainly jumped out at us, and I should say my project is a collaboration also with Tamara Wall from Desert Research Institute. So I'm very lucky to have somebody to bounce all of these ideas, many people to bounce these ideas off of. Some of the things we are starting to see emerge. This idea that collaborative research is a skill, going back to the idea that
The social sciences have been doing this for a while. These are skills. These are things that are taught in social science coursework. But we have not provided our physical and natural scientists with enough opportunities to learn this skill. We saw that right at the beginning. We realized there was no way that we could evaluate these scientists based on standards that they simply didn't even know existed. So we changed our tack a little and really have been just focusing on, okay, what is it that we can learn as people sort of figure out how to do this work on their own? What can we pull together and aggregate together about lessons learned? And that's been a really, really gratifying and successful approach so far. There's a lot of interest from people in learning how to do this. People want to have their work used. That seems to be the holy grail among so many of us that got involved in this. I want my work to mean something to somebody. So even really senior scientists are coming to us and saying, how could I be doing this better? What can I do? What are some lessons that I can take away from this? So basically, it's, I think we're at a stage where it's not fair. We need to be providing the resources and the training if we're going to ask people to do this kind of work. Fortunately, that's something that has already started to develop.
Yeah, so here at University of Arizona, now I feel like I'm plugging the Wildcats, but here at Arizona we developed, my colleague Connie Woodhouse, who's a paleoclimatologist, who's a tree ring scientist, who many of you know. Connie and I and a couple other colleagues developed something called, which Sean mentioned in his introduction of me, the Connecting Environmental Science and Decision Making. It's a degree certificate, so if you're getting a graduate degree, you can get this additional certificate, which many universities have this kind of system. And the whole idea was what Allison just said, was Connie and I realized several years ago, and Connie very much took the lead on this, several years ago that Connie herself was never trained to do the kind of work she wound up doing, which was working with water managers to apply tree ring science. She realized we weren't serving us graduate students particularly well, and so she developed this degree certificate, and then the two of us teach the core seminar in that certificate, and that seminar is quite popular. As Allison said, I think there's a demand not just from sort of existing scientists, but from scientists in training. What Connie and I have been finding, and I'm actually studying these students as part of one of my projects, we've been teaching this for 5 years, and we're learning a ton about the demand side of this equation, which is to say, graduate students, this is a good Research One university. We have a lot of high-end PhD students. We're finding we're attracting a lot of these students who want to do what Allison said. They want to have their research be useful, and they're essentially not being trained in anything about how you would go about doing that. So I'm sort of the social scientist in that equation, and in that seminar we teach a lot of the stuff we're talking about here today, for example, and we make them read social science. We make them realize that social science is not the outreach arm of a project, for example, that kind of thing. So we are making some headway in this training issue.
Another lesson, co-designing these projects, getting the stakeholders, the end users to help articulate the problem and the research question, that's a challenge for a couple of reasons. One is the way that the projects are funded. We're all grant funded, so we have to write our proposals and get the money, and most people find that, it's at that point, okay, I have the money in hand, now it's time to go and start doing this collaboration and working with the end users. It's hard to figure out in our current system how to get that discussion going way earlier, how to co-write those proposals, co-design the project. It's really a paradigm shift to start thinking about, oh, I've got to have these other people weighing in on my research questions and bringing them into this process really early. I brought in just 2 quotes from some of our case studies that I think really kind of capture 2 perspectives from stakeholders. The first is just a little one sort of regretting that they weren't brought in early enough, and we're struggling to see how the science could be really well applied in their particular case. So, we needed to be brought in sooner. If we've been included as more of a real collaborator, they were saying, then I could really see how the science could be applied to our decisions. The flip side of that was another stakeholder who did feel like he'd been brought in right at the beginning, and recognized that the researcher that he was working closely with was really unique in that way, and that is not always the way things are done. He's looking at how this will affect decision making, and a lot of researchers don't take that step. He appreciated that he was brought in as the plan was getting put together, and that he perceived that his partner was looking ahead at how this information could be applicable in the future. So.
And just one thing I would quickly add is that the RISAs specifically, because the RISA network was initially sort of built in the mid-1990s, so CLEMAS is now the oldest one, but there are several RISAs around the country that are more than a decade old, and that institutional relative stability, we are grant funded, so it's not really stable, but we have been around for a while. We are stable in the sense that we have professional staff. In the case of CLEMAS, the RISA that I run, we have 3 members of our research team are part of Arizona's Cooperative Extension, and so we actually have a sort of stable platform from which to work. So some of these problems are mitigated with the institutional structure that we've imposed, which is to say we have people who can work. We do assessments sort of all the time, partly because of the way we exist. So we try very hard, we still fail at this, but we try very hard to bring in collaborators early in a process. We start conversations much earlier because we're not so dependent on short-term grant projects, and we're not so dependent on having to write a proposal to fund every single thing we do.
Which brings me to the next thing that we found is that those resources that are out there and are available are sort of still being used inconsistently. In our set of case studies from the Southwest CSC, we found about half of the projects were either using the landscape conservation cooperatives as, to support some of their research and collaboration, or one of them was using a RISA affiliate in the region. So, just to highlight the point that there are opportunities out there, there are resources. And then the other thing was, and this goes back to something Dan said earlier, there's still that lingering perception that social scientists are either just outreach people, that they, that they can just translate the science and that's all I need, or the, even worse end of the spectrum is they're expensive and they're kind of a drain on my science resources. So I think if we can combat those, both of those misperceptions, we can make better use of the resources that are out there. I think we are going to need to struggle with this idea of when are we going to see impacts. And by impact, I mean actual use of the information, that science, in decision making. Use of information is really influenced by both the ways that it's developed, all of that we've talked about, but also there are characteristics of the end user that is going to affect how fast they use it, when they use it, and how they use it. This is the little table here. It's just a couple of concepts from information science about different types of information use. So conceptual use is, perception. I feel better informed. I've changed my opinion a little bit about this issue, but it doesn't imply that that information has actually found a home in a specific decision. But accumulate enough of that conceptual use, the weight of evidence, et cetera, and what's going on within the decision-maker agency, and you really can get to that instrumental use on the other end of the spectrum, that information was used. But it might take longer than we think. So if you look at the guidance for evaluating that come out of the Office of Management and Budget for the CSCs, their standard right now is, that the information will be used within 3 years of the project ending. And I'm not sure how realistic that is. It's something we want to look at. When do we start to see that pattern of actual use? And then the other question is, whose job is it to track it after the project is over? That's a really hard one. If you don't see an impact on the day that the project ends, who's going to follow up and who's going to see how that information is flowing through the agency?
Which I got to say, it's highly unlikely you would see an impact on the day the project ends.
Yeah, probably not. We also might see impacts that are a little bit different from what we expect. We all go in and say, this is what I expect to get out of my project. But I think we also need to look both for those impacts that we're hoping to see, but also open up to other things. And this, again, is like, whose job is it to track all of this? So my example from some of our case studies is within one project, we saw one group of stakeholders who demonstrated that instrumental use. Yes, this information that we got directly contributed to an adaptation action that we're going to take. I mean, you could absolutely trace that line. This happened, this happened, this happened. We're using this information. Same project, slightly different group stakeholders, and they were saying, well, I'm not sure right now that information isn't going to feed into decisions, but you know what it did? It got us, a group of us together, and we're collaborating on a new proposal because of what we heard in this meeting. That's a great use of information. We're developing networks, we're building capacity, but it's not necessarily what we expected to see. So we need to track a little bit of both in order to really get a sense of what these projects are doing. Next steps. Our next steps on our CSC evaluation project is we're continuing to refine our framework. We're testing out these case studies. We want to get a little bit further into the user side, so talking more with the agencies about how they are perceiving this process. Frankly, I have about a million other ideas that if we could just invent a 30-hour workday, I might actually get to. We're also, Tamara Wall from DRI, my partner in this, and we're really working closely with Steve Jackson and Carrie Enquist in the Southwest CSC to see how what we're coming up with is going to be able to support their program building, the way that they're crafting RFPs, the way that proposals are reviewed. So we want to make sure that it's also supporting their program development. Blatant plug for some of the work that we've done. These are a few of the publications that have come out of the that we've talked about in this presentation and other work that we've done in this range. So if anybody wants a copy of the slides, maybe Ashley can send them out. I'm perfectly happy to share them all.
So one other plug, at AGU this year on Monday morning, there are 2 sessions plus the poster session on Monday morning, the first 2 sessions, 8 and then at 10, that are about very much what we're talking about. And that first citation on this slide is the project that I'll be talking about.
And before we take questions, I also want to point out the very last slide in here is a whole bunch of the references that we cited in the talk. So just for your general interest. Very happy to take questions.
Thank you, Dan and Allison. Thank you very much. So there's a few questions that are already coming in. So our first question is, how is the deliberate co-production different than community-based participatory research?
Thanks. That is a really great question. I saw that pop up really early. I think that there are fewer differences than any of us might want to admit. We wanted to talk about co-production of knowledge because that's a term that's really more common in this kind of the climate science world. People were familiar with that, but I think that many of the principles are really, really close to community-based participatory research. I think one of the key differences, though, is that with community-based research and participatory research, you're often dealing more on the social end of the spectrum, and I do think that there are some differences in the way that we need to think about our projects when we're bringing in really highly technical climate or other scientific data to the table, that there are some slightly different ways that we need to approach it. We need to think through a little bit more how we're going to integrate that science knowledge with the community knowledge. So I think that's the key difference. I think the process of building capacity, building trust, building relationships is so similar as to almost negate the difference. You know, that we could just call it that, but co-production of knowledge was something that was already sort of a really well-established concept in the climate science world. I hope that answers your question. And if it doesn't, feel free to email me, and I'm happy to talk about this at great length.
Thanks, Allison. We have a question from Jeff Morset, and he says, do you think the current funding model of NSF, CSC, and LCC present any barriers to co-production of knowledge?
You want to take that one?
Yeah.
Are there any NSF program managers on this call?
We do. I mean, I have seen it in a couple of ways, and we touched on it a little bit in the lessons learned. These are short projects. Most of the CSC projects that I've seen come through are 2-year projects. unless you already have a really strong relationship with your management partners across the table, it's going to take you that first year just to do the relationship building, trust building, getting to know each other, and and so maybe after a year you're in a place where you can really understand each other and move forward. That's why optimally, we'd have those relationships ongoing. We'd have, your partners would be literally co-writing the proposal, defining the problem, et cetera, with you. But that is incredibly difficult to do with the current funding model. So yeah, I do. I think it's a barrier, but I don't think that it's, as you pointed out, it's certainly not unique to the CFCs. It's, it's the way that science is getting done now. I mean, if we could all be at universities with giant endowments where, we had the time and space to, really develop those resources and spend all of the time that's required to co-design, well, I don't know, that would be great.
I think the only thing I would add is that NSF was set up for a very specific purpose, and Allison mentioned in the very first slide, I think, Vannevar Bush's report, Science and the Next Frontier, New Frontier. NSF was built on Vannevar Bush's ideas of basic and applied science, and it still works that way, and I think that's fine. I don't think all science doesn't have to be done the way that we just described it. That would be fairly idiotic. Having said that, there are programs within NSF that, they do want to have impact, but the way it's currently structured, at least the proposals that I've been part of, and the way they're reviewed, the broader impact statement is essentially where all this stuff would be parked. And, it's difficult to get funded from NSF to do what we're talking about, beyond the issues that Allison raised about, a long-term relationship building. It's very difficult to get funded from NSF to do this kind of stuff. So I don't know if that's tractable or not. I mean, that's a big science policy question, whether NSF wants to get in this game or not. I do think the mission agencies like NOAA, they have been pretty savvy about supporting this kind of work, albeit at very low levels of funding. So I think there are models out there that show that you can do this kind of thing within the existing model, but I just don't think the resources are sufficient for the sort of challenges we're working on.
Thank you. The next question comes from Cynthia, and it says, you use both the terms transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary. Some define them differently from each other. Do you? And just a little side note that she added as well, it says the transdisciplinary being the generation of new knowledge when many disciplines are brought together, and the interdisciplinary as discuss but not change original knowledge.
So I'm so with you, and I'm even sorry to use the term transdisciplinary because it's such a muddy thing at this point, because there's disciplinary research, multidisciplinary research, interdisciplinary research, and now transdisciplinary research. The way that I was using it was, and the way that we used it in the manuscript, or the paper that we're talking about today, was fairly specific. There's no really this is literature I know fairly well, there's no really good agreed upon definition of transdisciplinary research. So we picked the one that we liked. And the one that we liked, there's a stream in the transdisciplinary research that supports what I'm about to say. It's essentially research, interdisciplinary research, so scientists or researchers out of university environments, say for example, engage with expertise outside of that environment, so outside of traditional sort of knowledge generation domains. So in our case, that means, in the example I gave, the Hopi Department of Natural Resources, our partners in this project that I mentioned, are full partners. So we're trying to use their knowledge, they're trying to use our knowledge. We're trying for a very integrated project. So it's beyond interdisciplinary, which really implies that it's a natural scientist, maybe a social scientist or three or whatever working together. This is that, but added to that is trying to integrate knowledge from outside the academy, outside of the domain of what we think of as sort of traditional knowledge production. I'm sure that was marginally helpful, but I'd be happy to point you towards some of the stuff that we relied upon in the way we frame this.
Thanks, Dan. Next one comes from Kristen, and it says, so you discussed the need to provide resources and training for physical and natural scientists. I'm curious whether you have looked at the boundary people and how they come into these positions and the kinds of skills that we need to develop for these roles.
Yeah, so that just reminds me that I forgot to add one paper to that list of stuff. I just co-authored a paper with Julie Bruger. I believe it's an early online release at BAMS now, so if any of you have access to that, you can get it there. If not, email me and I can send it to you. We did a whole series of interviews with those boundary people. We looked at people, we called them the first generation of climate science integrators. So people that are just largely self-taught, figuring out how to do this work on their own. And we really tried to glean a whole bunch of lessons from them about how they figured it out, what they'd like to do going forward. So that paper, I think, answers a whole bunch of those questions about, so now I've just lost my train of thought on making that point. Can you ask the question one more time and then I'll actually answer the question?
Sure thing. It says, so you discussed the need to provide resources and training for physical and natural scientists. I am curious whether you have looked at the boundary people and how they come into these positions and the kinds of skills that we need to develop for these roles.
Thank you. Yes. Okay. So what we found was with these boundary people that in our, we called the climate science integrators, so many of them honestly sort of fell into their roles. They had often kind of circuitous career paths. So they were, just in their own lives, they were integrating different experiences, different ways of looking at the world, and pulling that all together. And that seems to make them just a little more open to talking, to use Dan's transdisciplinary term, to those extra scientific actors, really curious about how decisions are made in other places. Some of the skills, some of the things that they talk about is that how do you teach people to listen and really think hard about what that person across the table is saying to you. They came up with an amazing list of suggestions, everything from internships. That was actually, I think that was one of the strongest ones, was let's try to embed our science graduate students in agencies as often as possible. Have them do internships where they just, or job shadowing, so that they follow around somebody who has to use that kind of information on a regular basis, and let them just, really think hard about how that's happening.
And one thing I'll add to that on that exact point is when we developed the degree certificate, the Connecting Environmental Science degree certificate and decision-making degree certificate I mentioned earlier, we did a much more informal survey, but we did develop the curriculum around most of the ideas that Allison just mentioned. So the students, the graduate students who go through our program, and in some ways this is how the seminar we teach is structured too, we focused on some basic social science knowledge. You have to take, in the curriculum, you have to take some social science, a methods class. You understand that it's real science, basically. But to Allison's last point there, one of the main things we require is an internship, because what we've learned from the boundary people, and I'm one of these people, is the experience is pretty critical. So you can do a lot of book learning and actually not know very much. And so we have found over the years that the more people are exposed to the reality of how this stuff works, the more quickly they sort of either like it or don't, but they at least understand how it works.
Thank you. The next question comes from Gregor, and he says, do you ever get resistance from those involved in scientist-manager partnerships who feel like they've been doing this all along? And if so, what's your quick answer about what's the difference between deliberate co-production and good traditional manager/scientist collaboration?
I think some people are doing this instinctively and doing it really well and have been doing it all along. I think a lot of what we're saying is let's start talking about this in the same terms. Let's start developing some frameworks for really understanding it better, so that we can all use some common frames, common words to reflect on our practice. I think even those people who have been doing this, all along and doing it well, we can all learn by reflecting on our practice. And so developing a framework, developing some common tools, gives us all that platform to work from. So I don't feel like I have never gotten pushback from the people who feel like they've been doing this really well. I found most people so eager to figure out how to refine the work that they're doing, to get better at it. So no pushback at all, totally the opposite, really eager to learn.
I've had almost the opposite experience to the pushback, which is that I've had colleagues who, when we get to chatting about the depth of social science knowledge, which Allison just presented brilliantly in this talk, they're like shocked that there's like, oh God, I've been doing this for years and I had no idea there was all this thinking that went into it. So I found over the, I don't know, 8 or 10 years that I've been doing this, that the more that the people who are so, have been doing it like instinctively, as Allison mentioned, the more they're exposed to the ideas in a more structured way and the reality of how much better it is if we can structure some of this stuff so that it's easier to evaluate, which makes a good case for funding and so forth. Most people I have experienced are psyched that somebody's taking on the idea of trying to develop basically the sort of science of decision support.
Excellent, thank you. We have 3 more questions. 2 of them are somewhat similar in what they're looking for in terms of selling points or suggested tips. So I'm just going to read both of those questions to you, just so you know the exact wording of them, and then you guys can give us your best pointers. So the first one comes from Mike, and it says, can you provide a few great quote-unquote selling points based on your experience that can be used by social scientists in the federal sector to convince management that deliberate co-production is worth the extra time and effort? And
sorry.
You can answer that one now, or I can read the second one as well.
Why don't you read the second one, which will give us a chance to think about this.
All right. The second one is from Mitch, and it actually mentions your paper, Stern Fireberg, suggestion of getting the right participation. With some of these wicked problems, even starting the co-production process and finding the right participation partners, etc., is critical and ultimately difficult. So do you have any tips, suggestions, and guidelines for proceeding?
Sure. Okay, selling points. No.
Well,
yes, yeah. I think that's part of this whole effort, both the work that we're trying to do, looking at the CSC projects, the work that the RISAs and CLEMAS in particular have been doing, is we are all recognizing that we need to do a better job of laying this out and making the case that it is worth the time and effort. So I don't know whether right now I can give you 3 bullet points, but what I can tell you is that as we start to collect systematically collected data and doing this careful analysis, we are starting to really see that the projects in which a longer-term relationship was there, certain activities happened. So it's not just that I've known them for 15 years, but then we sat together and we developed the project in this way. And they, the stakeholder contributed this to the project in terms of, framing the question, doing this. We're starting to see and be able to collect all of that, if we can show that when you do that, you actually do get those impacts with the science, then I think then it starts to sell itself.
I think that's right. I mean, I agree completely, and I think that the summary of that is you can demonstrate if you're a social scientist within the federal sector and you're trying to make this argument, the words return on investment are probably compelling, and I think that what we have been trying to do in terms of evaluation, just to reiterate what Allison just said, is essentially, one of the things we're after is trying to understand, what is the return on the investment? And it may not be in dollar terms. That might not be the relevant metric. But that idea of the science, you get more bang for your buck in the science in terms of decision outputs or whatever, or outcomes, I think that's the compelling argument for this stuff, is that in the crazy resource-constrained environment we're in right now with federal research dollars, there's more and more pressure to demonstrate you have some social utility, and I think that's basically what we've been working on. Forget part 2.
I've forgotten part 2 as well.
Yep, that's fine. The Stern and Fireberg's suggestion of getting the right participation.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, so yes, I can suggest some ideas about how to pick your partners. couple of different levels, and I think we often default to, well, I've got leadership within this agency on board, so I'm going to be good because they're going to make sure that the next level down goes along with with this project. It's true, you do need leadership and you do need that higher level support, but if I could give you one point, which is go find the people who are the closest to actually using the information. Who is actually responsible, for example, writing the climate adaptation report for that particular office, who has to actually wrestle with putting the information into usable format. Work with that person as closely as possible.
Well said.
Excellent, thank you. And so we're just running a little bit over time, and we have 2 more questions.
Okay.
Another one had come in. So from Douglas, it says the CSCs and the LCCs have defined stakeholder advisory panels or partnership groups. This seems to be somewhat different from the smaller project-specific collaboration that you discuss. How can these structures fit into the co-production model? And are there emerging guidelines for how to construct and manage these groups to be more effective?
Yeah.
We have not in our work started to dive into the advisory committees, although, but what I could say is off the top of my head, I could see them starting to function in some of the same ways that Dan talked about how these longer term programs like the RESAs function. That if you can get some stability in those, I mean, I realize that the individuals have to, turn over within those advisory committees, but they could become the basis for having those relationships already starting and providing that venue for agencies to come in with their questions or concerns. If it comes to the stakeholder advisory committee, those advisory committees already know all the players and can probably act a little bit like a boundary organization in and of themselves, making those connections. So, oh, Fish and Wildlife has this particular question in this particular region. Let me connect you with this researcher that I know has similar interests in this region, and maybe help facilitate that co-designing of the project. I think that could be a really nice way for the advisory committees to kind of get their hands dirty in this. I'd love to talk more about what you think are the possibilities for that. That's just off the top of my head.
And I am embarrassed to say I think we're the only REIS that does not have a stakeholder advisory committee. Don't tell anybody. So I have no experience with that.
Thank you. And the last question comes from Amanda, and it says, it seems like there is a lot of underlying similarity between what your suggestion for research in terms of co-production of knowledge and collaborative governance, or joint fact-finding approaches used for collaborative decision-making. So are there important differences you would highlight between the research and the governance areas?
I don't know.
I think we get a little bit into that fuzzy area where a lot of scientists get nervous when you start talking about governance because they don't want to, or they still perceive, and I think there's some legitimacy to this, that the scientist should not be the decision maker. But I think there's also ways to think ahead about how that information can be used in governance and decision making and structure the way that the research is done to make it most effective for its eventual use in governance, but I'm not sure I'm articulating that particularly well.
Yeah, I don't have any genius ideas on this one either. I mean, I'm not sure I understood the question either, but there's a lot, the space that we work in, there's a lot of potential for politicization of the whole process. And it is tricky because if you're trying to engage with decision makers on doing science, obviously you don't want to corrupt the science. So, I mean, that's why Vannevar Bush made the distinction between basic and applied research. He wanted to keep politics out of basic knowledge generation. So I guess I don't have any words of wisdom other than to say that when we work in this space, we're very cognizant of these issues, and I don't have a good framework to point to or a good I mean, there's a lot of instinct that comes into play, and a lot of scientists that I work, hard scientists that I work with, more physical scientists, are very leery of the political process. They're very leery of their research being painted as biased, which is why we get into this boundary organization literature, which talks all about salient credibility. You know, that's a big point. Is it salient research, but is it credible? And it's a fine line to walk. I don't really have a good answer. It is the reality, though. This work. I mean, I guess the one thing I would say in closing is that this happens all the time. I mean, science gets used in governance all the time. It's just a matter of how much the people who are generating that knowledge are part of that process.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And then I just wanted to offer you guys the opportunity to, I know that Dan, you just said that you had a closing comment. So Allison, if you have any other closing comments, or Dan, if you have any more, that would be great.
I don't have anything in particular except to say if we didn't get to a question or you would like to follow up on anything, feel free to email or call me.
Or me.
Or Dan. Yeah, obviously we like talking about this stuff, and I'm very eager for feedback and thoughts, particularly because we are trying to do this work within the CSC network.
Yeah, and thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah,
this was fun.
This was really fun. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then Sean or Holly, did you guys have any closing comments or remarks?
No, just expression of thanks for getting the discussion started, and I agree this is a topic that we're going to be discussing, I think, into the future. There's a lot of neat issues that have yet to be resolved. So thank you both, Allison and Dan.